So I'd like to now we're going to roll into our next discussion, and I'll hand the reins over to Vinnie Nguyen. And so introducing Vinnie, he's he's currently the Global Fishing Watch U.S. Government Liaison Officer. Vinnie served 20 years in the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard. We led, developed, and harmonized data analytics between a multitude of U.S. government entities. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Military and Diplomacy Studies from Hawaii Pacific University and a Master of Arts in Asia Pacific Studies from the University of San Francisco. Over to you, Vinnie.
Thank you, Bruce. And good morning, everyone. Buenos dias a todos, and bom dia a todos. My name is Vincent, Vinnie Nguyen. My friends and colleagues call me Vinnie. You, the audience, can call me Vinnie as well. If you're here today listening in, you care about fish, the ocean, and our environment. You ask yourself, what can we be doing better to support the counter illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing movement so we can protect our world's fisheries, we can protect our people, we can protect our security of our nation, and we can protect our oceans for future generations. In this sense, you are my colleague and you are my friend. I am pleased to meet all of you, and thanks again to Bruce Vitor for hosting today and tomorrow, and to the team at Florida International University, Jack Gordon Institute, for bringing me on the virtual stage today with Global Fishing Watch and the IMCS Network. Now, as Bruce said, I serve as the GFW, Global Fishing Watch, Government Liaison and Analytics Officer. But more importantly, right now, at this moment with you, I am the moderator of this panel, and we are here today to have a fresh and honest discussion about IUUF. I'd like to take you on that journey with these three distinguished thought leaders from Global Fishing Watch, Florida International University, Jack Gordon Institute, and the International Monitoring, Control, and Surveillance Network. Tony Long, Bruce Vitor, and Mark Young. Let's bring your videos up, Tony and Mark, and let me go ahead and introduce Tony first. Tony Long is the Chief Executive Officer of Global Fishing Watch, and he heads up a team of distributed, talented people across the globe to guide the organization's mission. Before joining GFW in 2017, Long worked for the Pew Charitable Trust, where he directed their global campaign to end illegal fishing. And in this role, Long applied an integrated approach to combating IUUF by combining policy, tech, and enforcement efforts. During his tenure at Pew, he worked to promote ratification of the Port State Measurements Agreement, the PSMA, and also pioneered the creation of a maritime monitoring system to provide authorities with information to identify, sanction, and deter illegal fishing. Long joined the nonprofit sector after 27 years with the British Royal Navy. Now, Bruce Vitor doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce him. He's a humble man. He retired out of the U.S. Army as a colonel with 27 years of management experience with combined militaries, intergovernmental agencies, and in foreign relations. He served in multiple assignments throughout the world as an infantry officer, 11 Bravo, and a strategist. Now, Bruce now serves as the Director for Research Innovation at FIU, Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy, where he's spearheading work for their Security Research Hub. And finally, but not least, I'd like to bring on stage Mark Young. He is the Executive Director at the IMCS Network. The network was established in 2001 to provide a mechanism for fisheries law enforcement professionals to share information, calibrate tools, and collaborate on policy development to monitor the increasingly complex harvesting and marketing of fish around the world. The rise in illegal activities that has accompanied globalization underscores the need for cooperative enforcement, which Dan Schaefer was just talking about a little bit earlier. And it's needed across national borders. Now, previous to Mark championing the IMCS network, like myself, like Bruce, and like Tony, he was with the U.S. Coast Guard for 23 plus years, conducting maritime law enforcement at sea with a focus on fisheries in the Pacific. I'd like to give a round of applause and a welcome to Tony Long, Bruce Vitor, and Mark Young. Gentlemen, please bring on your microphone so we can conduct the questions. So I'd like to start the questions with Mark, actually. Mark, welcome. And we heard earlier from Dan Schaefer, who is FIU's FIU JGI non-resident scholar, as to the issue of phishing for security. He talked about a lot of items in there. But with your team at the IMCS Network, how are you guys helping to combat IUU phishing?
Thanks, Vinnie, for that. And also thanks again, too, for acknowledging Dan Schaefer's great talk. I'm hoping, because Dan and I were both colleagues in the Coast Guard at Pew Charitable Trust, I'm hoping that for your audience today, I don't sound too much like Dan's twin brother, because a lot of his thoughts certainly mirror mine. But in regards to the efforts of the IMCS network, I look at what our organization does by addressing what I call the 4 C's, which is communication, coordination, collaboration, and capacity building. Communication-wise, we maintain a website to support our members with sharing information on IUU phishing and disseminating the efforts, the activities of the network, as well as successes of its members. We do have a reference section on that, and very much what Bruce's organization is doing with that security research hub. The other thing, communication-wise, is planning and executing our global fisheries enforcement training workshops. Bruce was kind enough to mention that in the beginning. We do have a virtual workshop coming up in 2 weeks on the 13th and 14th. But this workshop is the only international conference that's focused on fisheries MCS, that brings together MCS practitioners from around the world to share their knowledges and experiences and challenges associated with addressing illegal fishing. Coordination-wise, certainly look to expand our network to beyond our current 70+ member countries and RFMOs that are members of the network. And then also offering opportunities to support our members in working more closely together. For example, of which we're supporting and helping to fund a strategic risk assessment on IUU fishing for several of our Latin America, South American members, Costa Rica, Panama, and Ecuador, who are looking to work more cooperatively together in addressing IUU fishing. Collaboration. Again, expanding network relationships, and especially in the last year with non-governmental organizations, private organizations, beyond just a government-to-government level, such as Global Fishing Watch, Vulcan, TrigMat Tracking, and as Bruce just mentioned, our first time ever with an academic institution, FIU as well, because of the work they're doing with the Security Research Hub. But what that does is that provides greater access for our members to the resources and the tools that those organizations have to offer. Global Fishing Watch's platform for greater maritime domain awareness, or the Security Research Hub for greater reference and background information on illegal fishing. The last of which I'll mention is capacity building. The network does not necessarily itself conduct the capacity building, but we look for opportunities to facilitate greater opportunities for members to take advantage of MCS training, MCS capacity building, especially for those developing countries that have limited resources or limited capacity. We also, as part of our network, we maintain a MCS equipment exchange program where equipment can be used free of charge, such as we have some underwater hydrophones that can be used to detect potential illegal blast fishing. And then also we maintain a register of vetted MCS experts that potentially could be used to provide support in specific areas of monitoring, control, and surveillance. So I think I'll leave it with that. Short and sweet, the 4 C's comes down to it.
Thanks, Mark. You mentioned the 4 C's, and communication, coordination, collaboration, and capacity building. These are great. But I can't help to think about data. I mean, with all of this, data is involved with the communication, data is involved with coordination, data is involved with collaboration, and data is involved with capacity building. You mentioned the hydrophones that collect data. And then you think about all the countries that are collecting this data, and you think about all the governments that are collecting this data, and then you think about the technology, the memory, the servers, the networks, the languages, the programs, they're all collected it. It's mind-blowing. And then you think about sharing that information. And then I think to myself, public versus stovepipe data. And so my next question goes to Tony at Global Fishing Watch, because I was just thinking about your answers, Mark, and I think to myself, public data, transparency of data. And so Tony, I've got to ask you, you know, with regard to public data and what Global Fishing Watch is doing with regard to sustainability through transparency, you know, is this something that can be challenging to countries? And, you know, how is Global Fishing Watch leveraging public data to combat IUU fishing? And, you know, if you can expand on that, you know, who are your new partners?
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Vinnie. The public data is always a challenge in the sense of many countries have a perception that if they own the data, it's far more powerful. But I think we're starting to see that people are realizing that data held in a stovepipe is not particularly valuable, and there's mistakes made, whether it be mistakes in interpreting the intelligence or just by the fact that on their own, no one is going to defeat combating the illegal fishers. We need to be able to work together. So that information sharing has got to happen. I've been watching carefully the chat. Interpol have set up the environmental crime program, and they work, it was originally called Project Scale. And that already has a network of information exchange around the world with Interpol officers that can help countries understand how to collate evidence, how to share information without breaking down that evidence chain. Now that is proprietary information generates, there's some kind of classification there. But we've also seen military agencies and maritime security agencies really struggle to share that information because the tail line, as we call it, you know, where the source starts and finishes, it can be really difficult to get that information out of groupings to the people who need it most. So we're seeing a much better use of public data to inform an understanding of what's happening out at sea. And that's where I think Global Fishing Watch is starting to help. So that public sharing of information, if we can understand what is happening out at sea and discern where fishing is happening, at the same time, we can work out that those vessels that aren't fishing could be doing something else. So there's a quid pro quo between understanding where the fishing vessels are and where they are, but they don't seem to be fishing. So we've seen that public information start to get shared in a much more collaborative way in order that we really bear down on this huge problem. It's just too big a problem to try in any one state to try and deal with on its own.
Thanks, Tony. You know, I have two things to say to that. One is the audience members. The last question we had in the Q&A box in here in the Zoom was at 10:08 Eastern time. So if you have any great questions for Bruce, for Tony, for Mark, I can facilitate them. Don't worry, it's no holds barred. Ask in Spanish, ask in Portuguese, ask in English. Oh, I'll have to ask my translators to help me out with the Portuguese and Spanish. But please ask away. They're here today live for you. And Tony, I want to talk a little bit of history for folks who do not know what a Caroline is. In the intelligence world, back in the day, you used to get pieces of paper that were printed. And on the piece of paper, there'd be the stuff that you could not share with anyone else. And everything below that was the stuff you could share with people. And then they'd rip it off the paper and they'd be like, all right, that's for you. I'm going to share that with you. And the rest is for me, right? And you're going to share the piece of pie I want to share with you that I want to share with you. So I'd share that piece of history with folks, make people laugh a little bit. Well, you know, Tony, you talk about data sharing, and then I can't help but think about Security Research Hub, Florida International University, Bruce Vitor. And, you know, Bruce, you were at Southcom prior to coming over to Florida International University and, you know, to help support their innovation process. How can we innovate what's going on with the U.S. military and U.S. Southcom vis-a-vis Florida International University Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy, which U.S. Southcom happens to be a validated academic partner of U.S. Southcom. So my question to you, Bruce, we talked about data, we talked about the IMCS network, the 4 Cs, collaboration, coordination, communication, capacity building, right? We've got to share this data. And so what can the DoD do? The Department of Defense, the United States, what can they do? And by the way, there was a question in the Q&A a little bit earlier by a person by the name of Rebecca with the U.S. Coast Guard, was asking with regard to the U.S. Coast Guard and maritime security, what can she do as an officer to help with maritime enforcement? But, from a larger umbrella, what can the DoD do to get more involved with IUUF, Bruce?
Thanks, Vinnie. No, that's a super question and a good transition from talking about data with Tony. I'd like to first start off with answering that, talking about the data, and you mentioned the tier lines and the ability to share information and classification levels. And so, again, for anyone who's familiar with U.S. Classification levels, there's a term called no foreign, which means no foreign disclosure. It means that within the U.S. government, they can only share with other U.S. Individuals and entities, and that's it. So Admiral Fowler, who's the commander of U.S. Southern Command, where I came from before coming over to FIU, he used to walk around the headquarters with a yes foreign coffee mug, right? So here's a 4-star admiral who wants to share information, and he finds that he has trouble doing that because he doesn't have the sharing agreements with the different countries to be able to do that. And when he has that, he's limited on the platforms and the ability to do that with certain systems. And when he has that, he has trouble with them sharing with each other. And so, again, that was the impetus for the Security Research Hub in order to pull in this open source, unclassified information that's out there. It's a matter of finding it and aggregating it into one location, and then to do something more with that as well. But to answer the question you just asked me, so you mentioned the DoD, Department of Defense, and the U.S. military or militaries at large, and you also mentioned the Coast Guard. So when it comes to IUU fishing, again, this is a priority that's seen by both, and so you see in the U.S. Coast Guard that they released their strategy to combat illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing in September 18th, 2020, and it's of a higher priority than piracy now for the U.S. Coast Guard. And so you see actions that are being taken to be able to get some skin in the game there right now also. And Admiral Fowler, again, the commander from Southcom, and in his comments during the illegal fishing conference in February that actually all of us on this panel were a part of, he brought up that when he talks to his partners, one of the top 3 threats that they all bring up to him is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, along with transnational organized crime and cybersecurity. So it's a priority with other military partners in actions. And so I think military as a whole needs to get involved. Dan mentioned in his presentation exercises and the ability to engage basically with other partners. And I think that's an obvious opportunity to work with other partners to engage. There's other security cooperation and capacity building opportunities for the military, and certainly intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance opportunities for collection and that sharing of information as a whole. In recent years now, we're moving from the air-land battle doctrine into multi-domain operations. And so not only are we looking at the traditional domains of air, land, sea, but now there's cyber, there's space, and there's the information environment of which you can't, in the military, just kind of break glass, go to war paradigm anymore. There are activities that are being done that are detrimental to national security interests to all the countries, and this is one of them because of the implications that it has. And so again, it's about getting involved now, before there's a crisis that happens.
Thanks, Bruce. Well, we talk about averting crises and having capacity building amongst militaries and maritime security agencies around the world. And I think about again the treaties. I think about strategies. I think about MCS monitoring, control, and surveillance, collaboration amongst countries. And so I think that you don't just need militaries, right? Which a lot of folks around the world think of militaries as kind of like a hard power, right? A tool of a specific government to lay on a specific policy, right? But I feel like it's the softer diplomacy that happens behind the scenes in order to massage these things, like the IMCS network. So, following on from Bruce's answer, Mark, I got to ask, you worked in the Pacific for many, many years, enforcing things and making people compliant with rules that they may or may not necessarily agree with, but in order to be part of an RFMO or a regional fisheries management organization, or to abide by sustainability goals of the United Nations, or to have good country PR, they've got to do certain things, even if it's going to affect the fishing business in their own home country, or if it's going to affect another business, right? So I gotta ask, like, what are 3 key things a network could do to really move the needle in combating IUU without resorting to, well, hopefully not resorting to gunboat diplomacy and beyond the capacity building of militaries? What can the IMCS network do to really move this needle?
Thanks, Vinnie, for that. And I think it's not necessarily just the IMCS network, but it's a network or a framework in of itself.
Yeah, good point.
But there are 3 things that I can think first off of what can be done. And the first is to work together, recognize that there's no one country can go out there, and even if they have the best resources, the US can't solve this issue by itself. One country can't do it alone. There's power behind having a regional framework and regional cooperation and working with one another. And one of the best examples for that, Dan Schaefer earlier talked about it, but it's look at the regional framework and the regional MCS framework that's established by the 17 member countries of the Pacific Island Forum Fisheries Agency. They agreed and actually published a regional MCS strategy, 5-year strategy, where all 17 countries formally signed up to it, where they shared their goals and objectives of how to really address and work together to solve the problem of illegal fishing in their waters. They also have established a regional framework of tools. They have a regional VMS, and they share that VMS between the different members. They operate a regional fisheries coordination center that helps put on 4 multilateral surveillance operations per year that involve not only the 17 members of the FFA, but also what we call the quadrilateral framework, which is the defense forces of the United States, of France, of New Zealand, and Australia in supporting those. So Dan mentioned as well the NUA Treaty, which is very powerful. That was established to facilitate effective cooperation and enforcement in fisheries surveillance and enforcement. And through that, they have really expanded what I like to say, the range of MCS tools in their tool belt, where they cross-vest enforcement powers of fisheries officers, or they even can share their patrol assets. I mean, think how powerful that is, where the patrol boat that's flagged by Micronesia sails into Marshall Islands waters and can enforce Marshall Island laws as it relates to fisheries. That's powerful. And it's a mechanism that has been implemented in place in this one region. They have really set the standard for effective regional MCS framework that can be used as a template in other regions of the globe. So that's one. 2, I think it's really important to understand the risks or threats related to illegal fishing that you're facing, especially when we have limited resources or limited capacity. because there's a need to do a risk assessment to understand the range of risks that related to IUU fishing that your country is facing, including the frequency of their occurrence, the severity of their risk, and then what I like to say is residual risk. If you've already got something in place to address it, is there still a risk that that activity is happening, and you need to address that? Conducting those risk assessments give you a greater understanding, or a country a greater understanding of what they're faced with, because face it, not every risk is the same for every country, right? And it also makes them better informed about exactly what is the right MCS tool to use. If your biggest risk is a foreign vessel that is incursion in your waters, it might not be exactly the same tool needed to address unreporting of fish on the vessel log. Totally different things where one aspect, boarding and inspection schemes, or electronic reporting and electronic monitoring, either one of those tools is best to solve that particular risk. And then understanding too that once you've done a risk assessment, risks change, right? And it's like squeezing a balloon. If you squeeze in one place, it expands in the other. You have displacement. So you have to understand that these risk assessments should be continual and living. And you have to revisit that and understand whether or not those risks have changed over time. And three, something that we've been talking about already, and that's, you mentioned it yourself, making effective use of information and data. I forget who said the quote, but I heard it recently: data everywhere, and not any to sync, right? SYNC. You need to use data, and you need to use more than one set of data or one tool. Employ multiple data sets and sources of information. And it's only by doing that where you can really uncover anomalies or gaps or risks associated with illegal fishing. So I've seen that one area in fisheries compliance that's really been lacking is this conducting effective data analysis, or looking at the data you have and understanding what is it that you see out there. There's tons of information that is gathered, that is shared, publicly available, but very few people or organizations are doing anything with that data in terms of doing any data analytics. They're collecting the data for data's sake, and we need to get beyond that. Employing effective data analytics to uncover these anomalies and gaps may indicate issues related to IUU fishing or other illicit activities that are on the water. And that, more importantly as well, needs to be done in near real time, and not just historical, because by doing it in near real time offers opportunities to have emergent enforcement responses to actually address an activity that might be occurring in near real time.
So, I think about near real time data. I think about transparency of this data. And I think about how can we as a human race work with that data, right? You mentioned data everywhere, and we're processing all this data. And then how do we filter this data? And I think to myself, is data sharing enough? What does transparency really mean? I think that transparency breeds self-correcting behavior, and I think you mentioned that before, Mark. And when we think about that, I can't help but think about social media. And when we are regulated in a way with social media where we actually have to put our persona out there, we're not anonymous, we're more than likely going to act in the correct way if you believe humans are inherently good, right? And I believe humans are inherently good. We all want to do the right thing, right? And with social media regulation, if we have our reputation out there, we're more than likely not going to do bad things if people know who we are, right? And so if transparency breeds self-correcting behavior, if we can get all the data out there in a transparent fashion, is it enough? I mean, what does transparency mean? And so I want to bring back that question to Global Fishing Watch, Tony Long. Is it enough? I mean, when we think about social media and having the regulators that regulate social media companies to make sure that items out there are completely transparent to support self-correcting behavior. When we bring it to the IUUF problem, does transparency of the IUUF data around the world in a clear user design work? What does transparency really mean to you?
I think data sharing, Bruce. Sorry, I keep calling you Bruce. I've got Bruce in the main part of the call. The data sharing can make a huge difference. It needs to be at scale. The idea is we need to break down those barriers that exist at the moment between countries who aren't sharing data, who don't have the data available to them. The illegal fishers are just using those electronic walls to hide behind. So by bringing the data out into the open, we immediately start to produce a deterrent effect. So data sharing in itself is huge. What we've seen at Global Fishing Watch is the presentation of data at the scale that we're doing it is also effectively having a crowdsourcing effect. We're seeing universities around the world and agencies that are interested in this area for the first time able to get huge amounts of data together at the same time to produce high quality research that can drive better policies. And we've seen universities now using our data to indicate where bonded labor is happening on the high seas, or where fuel subsidies are being used to extend the range of the vessels, and which nations are doing that and to what economic advantage. Over 50% of what happens out on the high seas would not be economical if it wasn't for subsidies or bonded labor. And we know that thanks to our data and the work done with Unregulated and Nguyen. And we're producing this sort of work now that's really sort of driving the way that policies are understood. Similarly, if every single country in the world establishes a very good monitoring and control system, it still won't be as good as if every country in the world worked together to solve the problem, because there's still going to be information lost in the stovepipes created. And the high seas in itself is one huge area of concern, because everybody is responsible for the high seas, yet nobody has responsibility for it. There's no one actor in charge. So we've got to use that common ground. And I think if you're going to fish a common area like the high seas, the information for what you're fishing and how ought to also be common information. And much of what Mark Young has just said, I won't reiterate because I agree with everything, but he's got a huge experience in this area, in some of the areas of the world where fishing is so vital for the local communities and the region, that it's not going to stop. What we have to do is find a way to make sure that it's sustainable. I just add one other thing, Vinnie.
Sure.
There are a few cross parallels. So piracy, for instance, that caused a huge response by over 30 nations were involved in the counter-piracy operations in the Gulf, in the Horn of Africa and off of Somalia. The cost of the piracy against vessels that were really targeting the oil, they were concerned about the oil, is a drop in the ocean, quite literally, in comparison to the cost of IUU fishing globally. Yet we managed to bring 32 different nations together, including Russia, Iran, the Gulf states, the European states, the Americans, the Africans. Everybody was talking. There was a shared awareness. It was called SHADE, shared awareness and deconfliction, all being shared at an unclassified level in order that those nations could defeat the pirates when it comes to how they were trying to pirate against oil vessels and demand huge ransoms. We need the same impact on IUU fishing. And that, in a way, that's the model we're trying to create with Global Fishing Watch, that the data is there, open, shareable, communicatable, and that we can crowdsource everybody to take this data, rather than me trying to create a superhuman Global Fishing Watch personnel account where I'm trying to save the world. I want everybody else to use the data wisely to save the world for them. there was two questions that came up in the Q&A, which I couldn't type and listen at the same time. Kev Fleming said, why would government share their information if they risk exposing the fact that they've got bad behavior? And what we've seen is countries want to do that now. They recognize that the forward step of sharing the information can be spun appropriately to make it clear that they are taking leadership. They know there's illegal fishing there. By driving forward transparency, they say, yes, we know. That's why we want to share our data to help bear down on it. So Panama has often come under criticism as a flag of convenience. They really want to lead the way to change that reputation. We've seen some of the Southeast Asian states also concerned about their reputation, and can we make them make this step to say they can embrace it? And there was another question about how do we incentivize? I think open data is scalable globally, whereas enforcement data generally isn't. And if we can reward the compliance first to allow a ship into port that is showing itself to be compliant, to have faster access to market, that will also drive those grey actors into the better position, because they can get access to market as which they want. And where the information is missing, they simply don't get in.
So Tony, you bring up two great points. Two things that popped up in my head. You'll laugh when I say this. The tragedy of the commons, which we all know is an economic term, right? And in the high seas, the tragedy of the commons is quite prevalent, right? And so how do you provide for transparency in data that incentivizes folks to do better? And I can't help but think about living in a common space where we all share the kitchen. And how do we ensure compliance for everyone to be clean in the same kitchen, for all of us to eat in, and to make sure that people don't eat our food? Well, the same thing happens with our food as our fish, right? And this tragedy of the commons can be supported by Global Fishing Watch's map, which GFW's map was recently used to support U.S. Coast Guard's Cutter Stone to deploy to South America and work on Operation Southern Cross. And they worked with several shipwriters in Latin America, including the Brazilians, in an effort to combat so-called IUUF. And so the U.S. Southern Command says its heightened focus on IUU fishing reflects the priorities of Latin American governments, which sadly are struggling to police their maritime territories, protect their fragile ecosystems, and the livelihoods of their local fishermen, which at the end of the day, for some countries, fishing is a national security item, number one. So let me ask you this, Bruce. You're at U.S. Southern Command, retired Army, you're at FIU now, you're kind of having a leg in the academic world, you're having a leg in the military world, or helping the military world innovate through academia to support counter IUUF. Is the sudden U.S. focus on IUU fishing, merely a way to, shame China, or are the U.S. armed forces genuinely concerned about marine protection? This is a largely a Latin American audience, which is why we have translators in Spanish and Portuguese here today. And so, China is the elephant in the room for many groups. But let's talk about Latin America, and let's talk about Asian fishing fleets that overfish in the South Atlantic. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking what you were talking about, the tragedy of the commons, Vinnie, and I swear you're describing the tragedy of my kitchen at home. I find myself having to hide cookies and sweets and stuff. It's pathetic. No, I think in the age of great power competition and strategic competition, it's easy to say, well, this is just another, just trying to stick it to China effort, right? But I think it's more than that. I mean, you really have a hard time, talking about illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing without China being in the conversation or part of it, just because, they have 3,000 vessels, they're the largest fleet out there, and the impact that has overall. And as there's overfishing occurring in the South China Sea and closer to China, those fleets continue to go farther and farther away and impact more and more countries. So, but I think that, you know, some of the things that we've talked about today is there's a realization that this is more than just an environmental issue. It's more than an economic issue. It's a national security interest. And I think that that's why there's the emphasis that's happening now because of that. And when you look at, you know, what Monica was talking about with the maps and the transparency and stuff, it's not like here are just China vessels or singling out a certain country. It's those that are loitering, that are potentially at risk of doing illegal activities that the focus is on, and I think that's where the effort is. I think ironically, you know, I mentioned great power competition. When dealing with China or anyone who is you know, involved in IUUF, it's really not about competition. It's about cooperation, which is something that we've talked a lot about today also. And how do we get those actors in compliance with the laws and the policies that exist, and to cooperate with others on those.
Thanks, Bruce. And I just want to pop up the Q&A and make a note and a nod to Robert Tremlett. He makes a comment that, you know, it's not just China, right? And there's this Western thinking that, you know, it's only China who's overfishing these seas. And it's definitely so not true, right? They have a large distant water fishing fleet that is subsidized by their government. But as a Chinese academic who spent time in China myself, I tell people all the time, there is a large environmental protection movement in China that helps regulate the government there. So I just want to let you know that, Robert, we do realize that it is not China, and there are lots of other ones, especially I think we've noted at the Global Fishing Watch map, there are several other countries that are overfishing around the world. Okay, so with that, I want to move to a Q&A question that I'm reading here, and that is, let me pull this up. Yes. All right, so I don't know if the audience and the panel members out there are movie buffs, but recently a couple controversial movies came out that are regarding forced labor, human slavery, and unfit working conditions aboard fishing vessels. You know, if you haven't seen these movies, I'm sure you can look them up. There's a Thai film by the name of Buoyancy. It was inspired by actual events. A 14-year-old Cambodian boy becomes a victim of human trafficking when he's enslaved on a Thai fishing trawler. And another movie made by our friends at Vulcan, Skylight, Ghost Fleet. Ghost Fleet follows a small group of activists who risk their lives on remote Indonesian islands to find justice and freedom for the enslaved fishermen who feed the world's insatiable appetite for seafood. Now, these films speak to a business practice that is ages old, whereby you get labor at the cheapest cost and charge the highest price for your product. There are lines, however, that we need to draw to protect humanity working at sea. And we all have different lenses on what is labor abuse around the world, United States, China, Russia, you know, here in Latin America, Ecuador, Uruguay, Paraguay, Mexico, Chile, Argentina. We all have different viewpoints, even though we may have cultural similarities. But at the end of the day, we're all human. And so recently it's been discussed that regional fisheries management organizations begin implementing conservation management measures, or CMMs, as they're called, that govern fishing labor contracts to prevent from modern day slavery, or that the port state measurement agreement should include this as part of their model to take in fish. Are any of your organizations, Global Fishing Watch, FIU, or IMCS Network, doing anything to advance these policies on what's called modern day slavery at sea? Anyone want to take that question?
I can start off with a bit of use of data, Vinnie.
Go ahead, Tony.
What we're finding is that if we can monitor a vessel fairly continuously, which we can when they're transmitting on AIS, and there are a surprising number of vessels that continue to transmit on AIS for many reasons. But even if we're tracking them on their vessel monitoring systems, the less public and easily accessible data, what you can do is see their pattern of life, how they're operating, how many days at sea they're spending, how many fishing operations they're doing each day, how many port calls they may or may not be making. And from that, you can quickly surmise whether working conditions on board the vessel are good or indifferent or bad. And what we're building at the moment in partnership with the University of California, Santa Barbara, are some algorithms that will look for that sort of behavior and start to flag where the risks might be in certain vessels' activities, which means ports authorities can have a risk assessment, both on the behavior of the vessel for fishing, but also the potential for bonded labor, and allow them to bring appropriate authorities or appropriate inspections should that vessel get to port, or deal with the flag state involved in itself as regards how that vessel might be operating. So it is possible.
Got it. Thanks, Tony. Mark, Bruce, any thoughts on that, or shall we move to another Q&A question?
Vinnie, I would just add quickly too that looking at it also as well from a legal framework, it's important that the right policies are in place, and certainly from the network's perspective, such international agreements or tools such as the Port State Measures Agreement is highly important. But you combine that with like the Cape Town Agreement, which addresses fishing vessel safety, or the IMO convention with labor. That's like a trifecta of agreements that can work together to really provide an opportunity or a framework, a legal framework that can be built on to be able to help address the issue.
Thanks, Mark. So it was recently brought to my attention that we are 4 men on a panel together. Bruce, Mark, myself, Tony, we're 4 men. And, in the fishing industry, there's lots of men as well. And I've been to several panels about, gender equality. And there are those that believe that maritime security surrounding IUUF can be solved at the root level with better policies supporting gender equality, promoting women in the fishing industry, ashore and at sea. For example, in Africa, women are mending nets in Sierra Leone, building boats in Somalia, marketing ocean-derived goods across Africa's coastal communities. Defying traditional expectations, women are increasingly present at sea, even on board the ships fishing. Their full and meaningful participation in the economy, political decision-making, and society is key to addressing maritime challenges. But gender equity in the maritime space is sadly often overlooked, and there's lots of abuses, sexual harassment, especially at sea fishing, and for the observers as well. What can Global Fishing Watch, IMCS, or FIU do with governments to support gender equity or equality in your work? Bruce, you want to take that one?
I'll start off. I appreciate that question, Vinnie. Certainly, there's no shortage of qualified women to fill roles in the countering illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing or a number of areas. And so I just kind of describe, I think, some things that we do here at Florida International University and specifically the Jack Gordon Institute. But part of it really is, growing the next generation of analysts and professionals that are going to fill those positions also. And so, finding and recruiting that diverse group to fill those roles, training them and then empowering them and connecting them with government institutions and others where they can fill those roles. We have a robust intern program also with agencies and Southcom that we fill those analyst positions. And then it's also supporting programs like Department of State's Women in Peace and Security in order to get more women and other diverse groups into those positions.
Thanks, Bruce. Well, we have come to the end of our panel, and I'd like to conclude with a comment from one of our Spanish attendees. He has said, it's more than just a question, it is a comment from him, and it is to the issue of transparency in Chile, and by law, the information of the national VMS system is of a public nature. Therefore, Global Fishing Watch is an excellent platform that allows to publish in a graphical and affordable way. We believe that this practice should be replicated by other countries and states, mainly those that have fleets operating in distant waters, since AIS data has some limitations. And we all know that, and it's been mentioned in the earlier chat messages. With that, Bruce, Mark, Tony, FIU, IMCS Network, and Global Fishing Watch, thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to ask these questions and be here with you. And have a wonderful day. And I would like to say back to you, Bruce.